newsagents.
We are following this breaking news. The International Criminal Court moments ago announced it is seeking arrest warrants for the leaders of Hamas for the October 7th terrorist attack in Israel, and also seeking arrest warrants for the political and military leadership of the State of Israel.
This is potentially quite the most extraordinary moment. The idea that the Prime Minister of Israel and the Defence Secretary could be wanted individuals at the International Criminal Court and arrest warrants issued for them is a remarkable turn of events. I should also add that arrest warrants have been issued for the 3 leaders of Hamas as well.
This is the ICC, otherwise known as The Hague, and judges have now got to decide whether to issue those 5 with warrants. What does all this mean for the war in Gaza, for Israel's fate, and for what happens next on the world stage? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily, and a bit later in this episode we'll be talking about scandal and why we are so bad at dealing with them, policy scandals, and why it seems to take so long to correct them and to stop covering them up.
But we have to start with the extraordinary announcement made today by the International Criminal Court in The Hague that it wants to have arrest warrants issued for the leaders of Hamas for what happened on October the 7th, but more particularly the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Defence Minister Yoav Gallant for their response to what happened on October the 7th. So putting the political leadership of Israel in the crosshairs of the criminal court. And I should say that there has been a very swift, kind of furious reaction from an Israeli government spokesman who says this is scandalous and a historical disgrace.
Yeah, essentially the Israeli leaders, political leaders, and the Hamas militants have been accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And in addition, Netanyahu and his defence secretary Gallant have been accused of, and this is a direct quote, starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. You might remember that they talked about a siege of Gaza, and that is what has led the ICC to add this, if you like, additional war crime into it, directly starving a population, a civilian population from October the 8th. Now, if this goes ahead, if the warrants are issued, Israeli leaders could face arrest in 124 countries. This essentially means that Prime Minister Netanyahu, the active head of government in Israel, could not land in this country and many others without facing arrest. Important to notice that America, the USA, is not a signatory of the ICC, and they have hit back quite sharply. We've heard in the last hour from John Bolton, Donald Trump's former national security advisor, who has basically said that the ICC is making itself look like an illegitimate organisation because of the way it's issued these judgments.
Look, we have talked about the hemorrhaging of support politically for Israel as a result of the way it has conducted the war in Gaza, with the aim of liberating its hostages and destroying Hamas. But what there has been is the sense that Netanyahu is a political pariah. Well, actually, now judicially, he may become very much, in real terms, de jure, a pariah, in the sense that he cannot go anywhere in the world, maybe with the exception of America, without facing arrest. And what happened with Pinochet was it wasn't a theoretical thing of arrest. He was arrested.
He landed.
He came to Britain.
Yeah.
He was arrested. He was returned to Chile, but under house arrest for treatment because he was unwell. And a lot of people thought this was a major human rights advance, that actually, leaders of countries do not have international impunity. And Benjamin Netanyahu and Gallant, the defence minister, could be sanctioned, could be subject to arrest if this request for an arrest warrant is approved. And that is why it is so devastating a judgment for the Israeli government.
Yeah, and we should say that it starts with these 5 named individuals. It doesn't necessarily end there. It could actually take us further into people who've committed the military action on both sides, people who have devolved power to other people in their cabinet or, organisations on both sides. And I guess one of the questions that we've been sort of mulling is why now? What has happened now that has made the ICC maybe leap is too strong a word, come to this conclusion? And I think the answers that we're getting back are twofold. One, the imminent potential invasion of Rafah. Is the ICC trying to step in before more civilians are displaced or hurt or bombed or starved? Is that what's on their mind now? And the other thing, I guess, is a backwards look, which is a sense that if the ICC had acted more quickly, maybe a decade ago, when it saw what looked to be the beginning of this conflict between Israel and Gaza, could these more recent tragedies have been averted? In other words, did we need to have a stronger sense of judicial power against this militant political power to actually hold both sides accountable much earlier on?
And that is such an interesting legal question. But I think that the kind of why this resonates politically now is that if you listen to British government ministers saying why support for Israel should be maintained and why it's unquestioning, is they say because it is a democratically elected government operating within the rule of law according to kind of Western liberal values, and therefore it has legitimacy.
Yeah.
Well, you've got the International Criminal Court there throwing a huge question mark over whether that is the case. And you read out, Emily, the one kind of area about starvation. You can look at the other charges that it accuses Netanyahu and Gallant of willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, willfully killing, contrary to Article whatever, intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population, which is a war crime, extermination and or murder, contrary, etc., persecution as a crime against humanity. And so this list of charges against the leadership of Israel goes on at some length.
Yeah, and I guess if you wanted to have a moment of gallows humour in all this, then the ruling by the ICC has miraculously achieved something nothing else has been able to so far, which is bring absolute agreement between Hamas and the Israeli government. Because right now, Israel's National Security Minister, the hardliner Ben-Gvir, is urging his prime minister to ignore what he's calling the anti-Semitic ICC, and he's saying that the war in Gaza should be ramped up. And Hamas, on the other side, has also hit out at the ICC announcement and said that it equates the victim with the executioner. So there is this sort of perfect horseshoe where, for one moment only, the Israeli cabinet, who've called this moral blindness, and Hamas leadership, the terrorists in Gaza, are actually sending out the same message to the ICC.
Well, we're joined now by Sir Geoffrey Nice, KC, who was the lead prosecutor of Slobodan Milosevic, the former leader of Yugoslavia, when he was on trial at The Hague. And
Sir Geoffrey, just talk us through what this actually means. Is it the big moment that it feels like?
It is a pretty big moment. For two separate reasons. On the one hand, it's a very big moment for the people of Israel and the people of Gaza, and for the people named in the warrants that the prosecutor wants to be issued. But it's also a bigger moment for the rest of us, because it shows that finally, where there may have been tensions between politics and law, and where politics has sometimes been able to impede law, that day may be past. The public has perhaps for a long time hoped and expected that the law would apply wherever it may properly apply. And now at last, in respect of Israel, we're seeing that happening. So I think it's important for those two reasons. But at the moment, it's principally a big moment for those in Gaza and indeed in Israel.
And what are the next steps that need to happen? I mean, the arrest warrant has not been issued, has it yet, for Netanyahu or Gallant or the Hamas leaders?
No, and so the judges have to consider the evidence in the application. I imagine they'll do that pretty quickly because at the moment nobody dares drag their feet in respect of this overall and terrible conflict. If they decide that there's no reason to grant the arrest warrant, then subject to the matter being taken on appeal, that'll be the end of it. If they do grant all or some of the arrest warrants that Mr. Khan has asked them to grant, then they'll be issued, or to issue if they issue them, then it's up to countries into which any of the named people may fall to hand them over to the court. That, of course, is likely to have the effect of restricting the movements of those people, as it did in the past to some extent, for example, with Bashir of Sudan.
So just spell that out for us. Does that mean that Netanyahu could not, after this, get on a plane to fly to this country without risking arrest?
Absolutely, yes. It would be difficult for any state party to the ICC not to hand over somebody named in an arrest warrant. If the person concerned were a head of state, he might still be able to claim and argue that he should enjoy head of state immunity or other immunity, perhaps as a very senior minister. But I'm pretty sure they would argue that out in advance in order to have guaranteed undertakings of freedom to travel. Absent that, then yes, they'd have to be arrested.
The theory of justice is that it operates entirely independently of the political process. Do you think the International Criminal Court will be aware, cognizant, intimidated maybe by the political pressure it is probably going to come under as a result of this?
Every international court is likely to be vulnerable to political pressure, and many of them are likely to have succumbed to it. And we don't have to be particularly prissy about that. It's what governments would want to do if they see their interests affected by a trial that's happening that doesn't necessarily concern them immediately, but that might concern their interests. And certainly I have experience of direct political pressure being applied in order to corrupt the process of an international court, and others who dealt with international courts, and I saw one of them standing beside Mr. Khan this morning, have had similar experience. So don't be surprised about it. Don't even be shocked by it. It's what governments should be doing. It may well be, and this is certainly suspicion, but it's no more than that, that the ICC will have been under pressure from the United States not to be too severe with Israel. You may remember, both of you, I imagine, that when the ICC came into being, the then Labour Foreign Secretary, if you remember this, Robin Cook, said infamously, this court is not here to deal with prime ministers and presidents. And that sort of thinking about politicians and political leaders about their fellow leaders may well have led to people saying, oh, no, you can't take political leaders of this kind to court. So, yes, you can expect pressure. But if you apply pressure improperly, there comes a time simply when the body subject to pressure has to say, either I give in altogether, in which case I might as well not be here, or I simply now have to push back. And it may be that the combination of circumstances and the real concern felt by the public around the world about what's happening in Gaza will have meant this was a time at which pressure will not operate on the court. Because if it did in any way, and if that ever leaked out, the validity of the court and indeed the validity of international criminal justice for wars would be pretty well wiped out.
Sir Geoffrey, fantastic to speak to you today on the News Agents. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Maybe on a journalist's computer keyboard, we just ought to put in an F5, which says, new report gives damning evidence of government failure too, and then we can just write the rest of the sentence. Because this week, government failure to ... the health scandal over contaminated blood products, which has just come out. We've also going to have the post office inquiry, which is apparently the greatest miscarriage of justice in British history, with the prosecution of hundreds of sub-postmasters and mistresses between 1999 and 2015. And so it seems to go on.
Yeah, I mean, there'd be a Shift F7 key, I think, which also added decades of failure and cover-up. And today, as we speak, we've just had the Infected Blood Inquiry publication, the final report, which is by Brian Longstaff, which has an apology as ministers are preparing to pay out billions of pounds in compensation. And I don't think there will be anyone listening to this who says, what? What's happened? Blimey, what the what? Because we have been talking about the Infected Blood Inquiry for nearly a decade to, I think, 2017.
It started, yeah.
That's the voice of Sam Friedman. And the reason we've got Sam in is because Sam has been writing and analysing, researching the way we as a country handle, look at scandal. And by scandal, we're not talking about sort of sex scandals or the unforeseeable. We're looking at policy scandals, Sam, and why it feels as if, without putting a whole downer on everything we do, we tend to repeat the same mistakes time after time.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this particular scandal, obviously it happened 3 decades ago. The post office one happened mostly well over a decade ago now. But you can look at what's happening now and you can easily pick out 5, 6, 7 things where, in 20, 30 years' time, we're going to be, whoever's doing podcasts in 20, 30 years' time is going to be saying the same thing. We just repeat the same patterns of state failure over and over again. And for some reason, it seems to take 20 years before anyone will ever own up to any particular scandal. But there are so many examples all around, benefit system, immigration system, and so on at the moment too. And it's this sort of incredible deep defensiveness of the British state. Not necessarily that they intend to do something wrong, but when something does go wrong, rather than properly understand the risk, rather than be open and transparent around it, there's always an attempt to downplay because of the risk of costs, because of the risk of embarrassments, and then that sort of takes forever to uncover, and then eventually down the line you get to this. You've had it with Hillsborough, with Windrush, over and over again.
And Sam, just on that, you talk about the British state. I mean, there are political parties at the head of kind of running things, taking it in turns. It's been Labour, it's been Conservative, there's been one coalition government. It doesn't seem to matter which colour party is in power. There is still that same instinct, it feels, to cover up or to mitigate or not to be straightforward or transparent about these things.
Yeah, I mean, you look at all of these scandals, they tend to cross more than one government. Infected Blood covered Labour and Tory, so did the Post Office. It isn't a particularly party political point. I think you can probably argue it's got a bit worse in the last decade as a result of austerity, as a result of serious spending reductions, has made it even harder to argue for responding to scandals the right way by sort of owning up and investing when you need to. But you're absolutely right. This is a deeply sort of embedded pattern in the way that the civil service works, the way that British government works, well beyond any particular Prime Minister.
But Sam, isn't it incredibly simple on one level, which is it's all about cost? And that, of course, everyone covers things up because they don't want to have to actually, pick up the stone and see the earwigs and have to pay out the money.
Yes. Absolutely. And again, you can see that right now. I mean, there's been quite a bit of coverage in the last couple of weeks of the scandal over carers overpayments, which is that carers get an allowance. If they slightly overclaim that allowance, often through error, they lose all of it, and they can lose all of it for years. So you've got people who are carers, who have no money, who have sort of £40,000 debts being built up. It's a massive scandal. Guardian have been covering it for 5-6 years. BBC have given it some coverage. Government will not admit it because it would cost money to solve. Yeah. It really is that simple.
Or the cladding over Grenfell, presumably, where thousands of people end up realising that they're living in houses that may not be safe. But it takes a huge step to say we're going to rebuild everyone's houses, right?
Yes. Yeah. And that one in particular would have been extremely expensive. But even like carers allowance would cost, I think, a few $100 million at most to resolve, probably less. Even for like fairly small amounts of money in the vast scheme of £1 trillion of government spending, they will just still not want to give anything away unless they have to.
Sam, can I ask an idiot question, which is, are we worse than other countries, or is there different factors at play? Why has it taken us so long to resolve the issue of the contaminated blood scandal, which kind of, when you think about it, started in the early 1980s in the wake of the arrival of AIDS in the world.
It's a really good question, and I don't think it's got an obvious answer. I think part of the difference between us and other countries across so many policy areas is that we're incredibly centralised. So in a lot of countries, a lot of policy is done at the local or regional level. Here, everything is responsibility of national government, which means everything that goes wrong is the fault of national government. So all the fault and blame is sort of focused in one area, whereas it's a bit more spread out. And you think about American scandals, there are often kind of mayoral ones, there are kind of state level ones, then there are national ones. So the blame gets a bit more kind of mixed, whereas here it's always the centre, and thus the centre get increasingly defensive because they're trying to deal with every problem all at once.
But if a new government came in, right, let's imagine that there's a change of government in the next 6 months and you've got Keir Starmer at the helm. I mean, it's unlikely that his first act, as Prime Minister, is going to be to, let's have a really jolly good look at all these scandals that are brewing and try and stop them, right? Because, again, why would you as Prime Minister want to look backwards? Why would you want to sort of give yourself that headache in your first Parliament, your first term?
Well, I think that there's one argument for doing it, which is that it's not your fault right at the start.
Yeah.
Right.
It's very easy to apologise for things you haven't done.
It's very easy to apologise for things you haven't done, and it's actually quite politically convenient to create a list of all the things that your opponents have chosen to ignore and say, look at the mess that they've left us. We can't necessarily fix all of these problems right away, but here is the list of all the problems that we've been left. So I think there is a bit of a take out the trash moment that a new Labour government could do and say, here are all the next level of scandals. But doing that, the downside is, yes, that would lead to some cost. They would have to admit that they need to invest more in welfare, that our immigration systems are broken, and that would be expensive to fix, and so on and so on. So I think that is a political moment where it's the easiest to do it that it will ever be, but there is a bit of risk attached to that.
I suppose the other thing that comes out of this is the erosion of trust, where you wait for an inquiry like this, the contaminated blood scandal, which starts in, kind of 40 plus years ago. No head is going to roll. No one is going to be held accountable. We wait to see whether anyone will face sanction as a result of the post office scandal. And you just get a sense that maybe at state level, there is a degree of impunity, which in a liberal democracy should be simply unacceptable.
Yeah, and part of that is a function of the timing, right? One of the reasons it takes so long is that everyone who could be sanctioned needs to get out of the way before anyone will sort of accept that we need to have an inquiry. So there's no risk to any individual. And I think that's why, for me, the really important thing to learn from the post office, from infected blood, is not so much the specific lessons of the individual cases, as bad as they are, but how do we stop this much, much quicker in future so the people who are actually in charge are held responsible, although they haven't retired 20 years before. That's got to be the kind of lesson that we take from this, rather than just sort of rolling our eyes at yet another scandal.
Sam, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
So the story breaking throughout yesterday evening and overnight was this 3 helicopter convoy stuck in bad weather in the hills somewhere between Azerbaijan and Iran. And the reason everyone was gripped by it was because somewhere in those 3 helicopters was the president of Iran and his foreign minister. And rather like the magic trick with the cups, no one quite knew which helicopter he was in, but we did know that one of the 3 had crashed. And overnight, the news was confirmed that he died. And the kind of pictures coming out of Iran have been really complicated, because we have seen sobbing newsreaders, we have seen Iran state television mourning this great leader and the passing, and we have also understood from the Iranian diaspora in the West, outside of Iran, just what a horror this man was and how many deaths he was guilty of inside the country he led.
Yeah, so there are a kind of number of things that need to be addressed quickly, build them up to knock them down. And one of them is, was this Mossad? Was it internal dissidents who managed to bring down this helicopter?
It was rain.
It was rain, it was fog, and it was a helicopter that probably hadn't been very well maintained because of the sanctions that are in place, which mean that engine maintenance is kind of not great, which means that mainframes can't be replaced. And so this helicopter was probably not in the best nick anyway. and in thick fog, which is most hazardous conditions for flying in, it goes down on a mountainside. Yeah. So that looks like it is not an issue. It looks like
conspiracy gone.
Conspiracy gone. It is what it seems. The other thing is, of course, that in Iran is that you have a president, but the president is not the ruler of the country.
Because it's a theocracy.
It's a theocracy, and Ali Khamenei is the supreme leader of the country. He is 85 years old. It was being talked about that potentially President Raisi could be his successor as supreme leader, but he was the number 2 in the Iranian government, not number 1. But it is still a big deal because on practical day-to-day matters, whether it be the crackdown on the need for women to wear headscarves or a whole range of other things, Raisi was the president and presiding over a country where inflation was running at something like 40%, and there were all sorts of problems internally.
Yeah, and he is called the Butcher for this reason, that he is a hardline jurist sanctioned by the United States for sending thousands of political prisoners to their deaths in 1988. And to understand a little bit of that background, you have to really understand that to be a political prisoner in Iran is not necessarily to try and, arson the government or set fire to the president. It is just to think differently, whether that is a religious difference, whether it is a difference in how you think women should or shouldn't be able to dress, or what you're able to say out loud. I think it's probably not coincidental that at a time like this, you hear from friends of Raisi, and the loudest voice is President Xi Jinping of China, who is mourning the passing of a great friend. One dictator loves another dictator. One theocracy loves another autocracy. That is the shape of things in terms of who is mourning this man now. And as for who is celebrating, well, we're going to hear from one.
Just before we get to that, let us hear a voice that was on Radio 4's Today programme this morning. He is Professor Mohammad Morandi from Tehran University. Because if the diaspora, as Mateless was saying, are kind of, thank God he's gone, that's not the attitude from a spokesman who is seen to be very close to the regime.
I think it's quite clear that people in Iran are mourning. He was a very popular figure among ordinary Iranians, and he was a person who was very popular among ordinary people because he he traveled often, and he went to the deprived areas of the country.
Well, that was Professor Mohammad Morandi doing his best to say that the whole of Iran is in a state of mourning and inconsolable following the death of President Raisi. I think for an awful lot of political activists, it's farewell and he won't be much mourned. Let us speak now to Omid Djalili, famous British actor, comedian, but also recently political activist.
Just tell us what this news means to you and I'm guessing many people in Iran right now.
Obviously, these things filter through very slowly and gradually. And I kind of thought I was in a dream. I didn't think it was real. But because I was up late in Toronto, it was confirmed that he had died. I've been joking about, it's very convenient when people think you're dead, you can escape. Because I'm always of the opinion that we're seeing the last legs of this regime and some people are cutting and running. So what a great way to fake your own death and run away. But it does seem that he has died along with everyone else. So it's a shock. It's something you never have expected. And I've just tweeted some of the creative memes coming out of Iran, which are very artistic, very kind of talking about karma and basically saying you mess around with women, the universe is going to come back and bite you. So I couldn't believe it, but I'm now trying to come to terms with it.
Look, Omid, you're giving us a very kind of one-sided view. It's worth saying that we heard a little earlier from Mohammad Morandi from Tehran University about what he thought of President Raisi.
First of all, you have to understand that this is someone, I can't believe even someone like Professor Morandi's been given any kind of oxygen. I know he was on Piers Morgan. I heard him on Sky News. The fact he's talking about this, that Raisi was a charisma. He had the charisma of a gnat. This person was was an embarrassment to his own country. He was a terrible public speaker, couldn't really manage anything. So the fact that there was even being touted as the next supreme leader was a great concern to people. So no, I would say that everything Professor Morandi has said is quite literally the opposite of what the people. He doesn't speak for the people of Iran. You have to understand, Morandi's in Iran. He's at the university. He's a mouthpiece for the regime, and anything he says really, as far as I'm concerned, really shouldn't be given any kind of oxygen at all.
Omid, I guess, charisma or no charisma, the thing that he is perhaps best known for is sending thousands of political prisoners to their deaths. I mean, wasn't he the man of the sort of 15-minute show trial who just put people to death?
Yeah, I mean, Emily, if you want to unpack what Professor Morandi was saying when he was saying, look, at the end of the day, the accusations that he'd killed 5,000 people in the late 80s, he was in his late 20s. He was on some kind of judicial review where there were lots of people in prison, and they just got rid of them, basically. They killed them all. And he's saying that they were all terrorists. I mean, and you're also killing Baha'is. I'm a Baha'i. The Baha'is are some of the most peaceful, patriotic people you could ever have. And all of them were literally there because of their beliefs. And this is a regime that wouldn't even tolerate contention. It's not like as if you're the anti-regime. It's even people asking questions. So a lot of those 5,000 people were people who were part of the 1979 revolution, who just didn't really want to be led by Islamic clerics. So they were purged. And there's no question that Raisi was in the middle of that, and he was so rightly called the butcher of Tehran. And in fact, I even sent a tweet thinking that it was where the helicopter crash was where lots of animals, and it would have been very ironic that the butcher of Tehran would have been, mincemeat for animals.
Would you say that this leads to any material change? I think the mistake we often make is we get into sort of Wizard of Oz mode and think that the house has landed on the witch and ding dong, the witch is dead. Whereas actually we know how these regimes continue, right? They basically, they sort of find the next person to come through who does exactly the same job because the supreme leader has still got ultimate control there.
I would say that's right. But then again, I personally believe we're seeing the final death pangs of a regime that are cracking down so strongly. I have a friend of mine who's half Iranian, half English, who lives inside Iran, and he's saying, I don't know what's going on for the past month. There are so many, like the army and police are all on every corner of Tehran looking to crack down. As soon as you see a one woman without a hijab, they're basically packed away. So they're trying to hold on to power, and they're trying to do everything they can to crack down on the people. And right now they're on the streets because they think that they're going to, if anybody celebrates, if people are going to celebrate, they're going to shoot them in the face. So I think that this is we're in a real situation where we're seeing the final moments of a regime tottering on the edge. That's my personal take on it.
Look, the geopolitics of the world right now is that, there's the America, there is the West, but you've also got Iran, where it's doing joint military exercises, naval exercises with Russia and China, as it was a few weeks ago in the Gulf of Oman. And people thinking, well, actually, Iran now is an essential supplier of weapons and possibly oil to Russia. And China quite likes the fact that there is an assertive other kind of counterpoint in the Middle East. I just wonder whether Iran has got much more support from big powers than maybe we anticipate.
That's absolutely spot on. And I think this is what's been frustrating the people of Iran, because all they've ever asked, the people inside Iran have just said, look, we'll deal with regime change, we'll deal with all those things ourselves. All we ask for is for people in the West to refuse silence and to put the IRGC on the terrorist list. That's all they ask, because once you do that, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, who are seen as the group of people who protect this regime, if you put them on the terrorist list, it delegitimizes them, so you wouldn't get big countries and other countries dealing with them. And the fact that they are continuing with Russia, they're continuing with China, is because even we legitimize them. We've been appeasing them and we still do business with them. So this is something the people of Iran are asking us not to do business with this regime. And the way to do that is to put the IRGC on the terrorist list, which we haven't done.
And I mean, the first time we had you on the News Agents podcast was to talk to you about the protests that were taking place on the streets about women being forced to wear hijabs and face coverings and the like. And President Raisi was largely behind that. Do you think this gives the protests a fresh impetus? Because it has felt, maybe it's lack of attention on our part, that those protests have been dying out.
I think the protests still continue, obviously, with what's happening in Gaza. That's the focus now. But we mustn't forget the people of Iran, and we mustn't forget also the connection with what's going on in the Middle East with Iran. That's something that we knew from the very beginning. There was a connection that they're funding all these terrorist groups. And now, unfortunately, we have taken our eye off the ball. And from the very beginning, we were all screaming about this from the very beginning. We need to do something about this regime, or all hell is going to break loose. And we saw that it did. So now I think there's an awareness now. And I know, speaking to certain government ministers, they have been aware and they are aware of what's going on. But it really needs the West, I suppose, to have our eyes open with this regime and really question. Do we really want to be doing business with them? Do we want to legitimize them?
Right, this entire episode, we've all been very carefully treading around the subject that nobody in the office is allowed to mention, and that is John's dog, Alfie, who I'm afraid did not secure a prize in the dog competition over the weekend. Sorry for your loss. Alfie, what were you thinking?
This is so unfair when we've all had to get to know Moody inside out thanks to a television programme where Emily apparently can't go anywhere without the dog, including the Royal Opera House, of course.
Always,
yeah, of course. And the worst bit about Alfie's loss in the dog show, it was in the senior Golden Oldies section. So
Perfect.
Alfie is 12 years old. Alfie lost to a bloody whippet.
Yes!
A 16-year-old blind whippet. I mean, if anything was going for the sympathy vote, it's a 16-year-old blind whippet. Alfie didn't have a frigging chance. Where was VAR when you needed it?
Absolutely. The trouble with whippets is they always look quite soulful and depressed. So all you have to say is, my whippet is blind. So shoe in. Sorry. But Alfie did come away with highly commended.
A highly commended rosette, which we are keeping.
I think he needs to be on steroids next time.
No, we're trying to build Alfie up, Emily. Don't try and talk him down now. Honestly. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.